Welcome back to my take on China, the final one from my hotel in Xinjiang, and I'll be back home tomorrow. Quite early, we're leaving here. I'll get home in the afternoon. I want to talk about the recent event in Zhuhai, and I'm not talking about the air show. I'm talking about the one that caused the incredible amount of controversy. I received hundreds of comments after posting the video about the mass murder. There were two questions that were predominant. There was a third, but we'll come to that later in another video about my issues with the death penalty. The most frequently asked question or statement that was made was, is this, or this was, a color revolution instigated by outside forces? We know who they are. The other question that was asked very often, or asserted as if it should happen, was this one. Why aren't the BBC's reporters kicked out of the country? Let's start with the color revolution first. Although I had immediately thought of this, I can't help myself. There's absolutely no evidence yet, and if there is, we probably won't get to hear of it through Western media, Chinese media, or even social media anywhere. This would be dealt with at a very high government and diplomatic level, and we'll hear about that because it would instigate a response of massive diplomatic proportions. I'm talking about the complete and total exclusion of the instigating country from all diplomatic, trade, military, and any other cooperations. So if the USA, if it were them, were thinking of instigating a coup in China, and this was their medium to start it, they would probably have understood the ramifications. China's patience with the US childish antics is sometimes seen as a weakness. It's not. It's a strength. And surely someone in the CIA would know that if it did do that, they would understand enough to say this would be a red line, as big as the president or sitting Secretary of State visiting one of their provinces without permission. Therefore, I'm inclined to think not. It would also bring Chinese people together. It has. I'm sure the fact that the police are monitoring the murderer's health very closely to interview him when he recovers from his self-inflicted injuries. I'm equally certain they already know everything about him by now. His debts, his emotional and his social life, how he got the money for a new car and the modifications for it. If it was from an outside source, we can bet that source will become known and appropriate action would be taken. Unfortunately, emotionally deranged people sometimes do crazy things, and there's no logical explanation. People looking for confirmation of their biases in incidents like this are likely to be disappointed. I could be wrong. I'm expressing my opinions based on logic, and there's evidence, lots of it, in existence that the USA, and particularly their three-lettered agencies, don't operate with the same form of logic that I possess. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not. Only time and an extensive police investigation will prove it though, so we should all just wait and see. One of the main reasons that the theory exists and the dots are being connected is that the BBC were on the scene very early. And it's not the first time. This happened in Shanghai when there were protests there at the end of COVID. How did they get the information so fast? I honestly don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to bet the Public Security Bureau already do or will very soon. Why were the BBC in the vicinity? This is a coincidence. Did the mass murderer have the presence of mind to think that his actions would be best performed that day when all the international media were in town for a very important event? That's a question only he can answer, and no doubt he will. Was he encouraged or incentivized to do it, is what many people in the comments have suggested. And again, only he can answer that, and no doubt, again, he will. Or was it just a very nasty coincidence? Most intelligence communities around the world, and I'm certain that the Public Security Bureau and the Ministry of State Security in China are no exceptions, do not believe in coincidences. So we can bet they've thought the same way we're thinking, and they're looking at that as an option. Now on to the topic of the obnoxious Stephen McDonnell. He calls me a liar and a bike-riding bozo on his Twitter feeds, but he's blocked both of my accounts, so he thinks I can't see them. He started the insults to me. I have no problem throwing them back at him. And since we both have the same level of education, He holds a master's degree in journalism, and I hold one in cross-cultural change management. We both live in the same country, and we've both done so for extended periods. You'd think there might be some areas of agreement between us. But I have not, in the last 4 or 5 years that I've been paying attention, or in the many articles and reports I've seen from him prior to that last few years, seen a single point on which I can say, yes, he's right about that. He never is. And that means either he is a consummate liar or I am. And I don't think there's any other way to put it. In this incident, while he was filming, he was approached by a man who shouted and pushed him. Now, I'm not condoning the actions of that man. I actually think that was wrong to do. But we have no idea what happened in the moments leading up to that man. They've been cut from the video. If, as McDonald intimates, this was an official act to censor the story, that was in his story, we can be absolutely assured that in what he reports as the authoritarian state of China, in which he's lived and reported for many years, he would not have left the area with his equipment, his memory cards, his Chinese film crew, or probably even his own liberty. He would have been arrested and held in custody. So we can wipe that one off. If the alleged assailant was a police officer, which he's intimated, first of all, I'm certain police officers had better things to do that night. Secondly, I believe he would not have acted alone. They don't. Thirdly, if China, as I said a moment ago, is authoritarian, McDonald needs to explain, again, how he left the scene without a mark on his body and with his camera gear and memory cards intact. It doesn't add up. If I were to take a bet here, I'd bet this guy's a relative of a victim. He seemed quite distraught. McDonald's approach was one of escalation. I have a much better approach. Console the man. Ask him if he's okay. Let him know you're trying to tell the world of a tragic event. And ask him, does he want to say a few words to the camera about his experience here? Had McDonald tried that, the BBC might even have got a decent interview with him and might even had a Chinese person complaining about security issues here in China, which the BBC love, rather than showing an escalation of event, which is embarrassing, and which they fabricated to show what this man might have actually told them. I'll put my reputation on the fact that the person who tried to stop the BBC filming that night was not a police officer. He was not a government official acting in any capacity of any sort, but I guess we'll never know. They forgot to ask him who he was. BBC will often tell you people they interact with or see nearby are plainclothes police. They often allege they're being stopped, and sometimes indeed they are stopped by the police. And when that happens, we can be assured they will film from a carefully concealed location to make the event look scary. And then the pièce de résistance the BBC always does when they interact with the police, they'll mute the sound of the footage and insert a narration over the interaction to tell us, the viewers, what's going on, rather than leave the conversation loud enough to hear or put subtitles in there, because we would all know what the truth is and who's lying. They're often followed by men in a black car. Of course there are. They're in remote regions of China, sometimes Xinjiang. There's plenty of black cars. And they're pretending to be reporters. They're not. Are those people following them? Or are they simply using the same road to get from one destination to another and being filmed? Do they think China's police are as stupid and gullible as they hope their audience are? Chinese police, if this is an authoritarian state, must be experts in covert surveillance. They wouldn't send 4 goons in a black car. They'd probably have a good-looking female translator on the BBC team sitting in the BBC car, laughing at them. The BBC will also tell us they've been approached by police, quite often when they've actually been approached by a local security guard. How many people in the BBC's audience would know the difference? I do, between a Chinese police officer and a Chinese factory security officer. Sometimes that security officer will call the police and the police will come. The police will then tell them they need to get permission from the factory to film inside it, or they need to get permission from the authorities to film outside of it in the street, because this is true. It's a public place, and setting up tripods, sounds, maybe lighting systems, they need approvals. They don't get it, and they get asked to leave. But once again, we have the biggest contradictions. First of all, there's a narration over the top of the conversation. So we, the people who know enough in Chinese, can't translate it. And then how did they manage to film the interaction at all and leave with the equipment and memory cards? Clearly, China isn't authoritarian enough, because one day a few years ago, I asked a very senior reporter friend of mine this question: why don't the police take their memory cards? His answer to me, with a very perplexed face: what? They can't do that. It would be illegal. He doesn't think they're authoritarian, and I can assure you, in all the events that I've seen of the alleged police doing something to the BBC, I've never seen any evidence that the person they allege to be a police officer is actually someone preventing them from doing the basic job of reporting. It's people who are authorized to do so, acting in accordance with the law and preventing people who are not authorized to do something from breaking the law. That's what happens to the BBC. And in every single case I've seen, with the exception of one, when Edward Lawrence from the BBC was arrested at the protests in Shanghai that I alluded to a moment ago, the BBC crew have walked away from the event with all of their equipment intact. Ed Lawrence was arrested, he was interviewed, and he was released with his equipment intact. And there's even footage online of his arrest. So much for the authoritarian stuff. I'm convinced his phone would have been examined, probably for information about who told the BBC where to go and at what time to go there. Their presence at that time was far too great to have been a coincidence. And remember, investigators anywhere don't like coincidences. So why isn't McDonald deported after all this stuff? The problem is, if China deported people like this, it would only add fuel to their already obnoxious fire. Even the two Australians who skulked out of China a couple of years ago, not deported, left of their own accord with a diplomatic escort, managed to write articles, and one wrote a book about his experiences. They're getting rich from the perceived oppression they created. And if I'm honest, I think the Chinese intelligence community know exactly who McDonald is. I'd be very surprised if they don't have people in his inner circle working for or with the BBC, because China is smart enough to do that, and they're not dumb enough to send shady-looking heavies out in an SUV to follow him. I also don't think McDonald is smart enough to pose a threat to China. And how about this for a theory? Maybe the Chinese authorities and intelligence community like having him around. They might have even facilitated his meteoric rise from a nobody at the ABC to the BBC's man in Beijing, because it suits China. I'm also half convinced that every time McDonald and his ilk do something stupid like this in Zhuhai, they get one step closer to summary justice being meted out. And while I don't agree with that, it's not something I'd be surprised or too concerned about. It would at least give the BBC a true story to report, that there was a violent incident outside of a bar in Beijing's Sanlitun or wherever else he goes. And finally, if they deport him, the BBC might send a real reporter who's able to find real stories that could embarrass China instead of embarrassing themselves. And I'm sure there are plenty around, reporters and embarrassing stories. So deporting McDonald wouldn't stop the BBC's biased reporting. It might create a rift in an intelligence gathering project that they've had in operation for years. And then there's the old maxim, better the devil you know. And Stephen McDonald is definitely a devil that they know. That's all for now. I will see you again back in my old studio, and I have another project I'm working on with Zhongshan, the city, and hopefully have some information about that soon. Bye for now.